On the morning the Harlan County office thermometer read 40 degrees below zero, 3 men knocked on Clara Marsh's barn door with their hats in their hands and their feet wrapped in rags because their boots had frozen solid from the inside during the night. They had laughed at her in October when she began digging the floor beneath the barn. They had called it madness in November when she lowered the first logs down through the hole. By December they had stopped commenting because there was nothing funny left to say. And in January, with the most brutal cold Harlan had recorded in 28 years, they were standing in the snow, asking to come inside the place she had built beneath the hooves of her own animals. This is the story of how Clara got to that moment, of what she dug with her hands in a barn that everyone in Harlan had already decided was a mistake. Of the winter that arrived like a verdict and stayed until it had said everything it came to say, and of why the men who had laughed in October were the same men who came to her door in January without being asked, because cold is the one argument that ends every other argument. If you stay until the end, you'll understand what Clara understood the first time she pressed her palm flat against the soil beneath the barn floor, that the earth doesn't argue. It just holds the temperature for those who know how to ask. Clara Marsh had come to Harlan in the spring with a wagon, a mule, and nothing that preceded her. No family name that opened doors. No reputation that softened the way people looked at her when she climbed down from the wagon seat and stood in the main street asking for directions to the county land office. She had purchased the old Perkins property on the north edge of town, the barn, the attached lot, and the small cabin beside it, for a sum that reflected exactly what the property was worth to anyone who knew Harlan's winters, which was very little. The barn sat on exposed ground with no natural windbreak. The cabin had walls that let the draft through in 3 places. The lot had no creek, no well of meaningful depth, and no feature that would recommend it to someone planning to survive the kind of winter this part of the territory produced every 4 or 5 years without warning. The men of Harlan watched her arrive with the particular attention that small towns pay to anything that doesn't announce itself in advance. They watched her unload the wagon with the methodical patience of someone who had done it before and didn't need help. They watched her walk the perimeter of the property twice before going inside the cabin, and they watched her come back out 20 minutes later, cross to the barn, and disappear inside with a lantern and a short-handled spade. The blacksmith awed, whose shop faced the Perkins property from across the road, watched all of this from his doorway and said nothing until she had been inside the barn long enough for the curiosity to become inconvenient to ignore. He called across and asked whether she was digging for something. She appeared in the barn doorway with soil on her hands and looked at him for a moment in the way that people look at questions they are deciding how much to answer. "Temperature," she said, then went back inside. Ord stood in his doorway for another moment, then returned to his anvil and told the story at the dry goods store that afternoon, and by the following morning, the version circulating through Harlan had been improved by multiple tellings into something considerably more entertaining than the original. She was digging for temperature. No one in Harlan had heard anything funnier in months. Clara heard the laughter reach her from across the road and through the barn walls and recorded nothing about it in the notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her coat. She had other things to record. If you're here and have ever kept working while people laughed at what you were doing, stay. The stories on this channel are for the ones who kept digging anyway. And this one hasn't reached the cold part yet. What Clara was digging for was the conclusion of a document she had found 3 years before in a boarding house in Kansas, an agricultural survey produced by a land assessor who had spent 2 consecutive winters in the Northern Territories recording soil temperature at varying depths and cross-referencing the readings with livestock survival rates during extreme cold events. The document's central finding was stated in a single sentence in the 3rd paragraph of the executive summary, and Clara had read that sentence so many times since finding it that she could recite it forward and backward without the paper in front of her. Below 4 feet of undisturbed earth, soil temperature in the northern plains rarely dropped below 38 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface air temperature. 38 degrees above zero, steady, reliable, independent of whatever the air above was doing. While the surface could reach 40 below, 4 feet down the earth held its temperature like a slow and patient argument that no blizzard had ever managed to win. The differential between those two numbers was 78 degrees Fahrenheit, the distance between freezing and surviving, between losing the herd and keeping it, between a winter that broke you and a winter you came through with everything intact. Clara had carried that differential in her memory for 3 years, not as an interesting fact, but as a plan, looking for the right property the way someone looks for the right tool when they already know exactly what the job requires. The Perkins property was the first place she had found that matched every condition on the list she had been revising since Kansas. Exposed ground meant maximum temperature differential between above and below, which was exactly what she needed the calculation to demonstrate. Existing barn structure above meant an insulated roof over whatever she built below, without the cost of constructing one from scratch. Soil composition. She had tested 3 points along the barn floor with the spade before making the offer, showed the clay content that the survey had identified as ideal for hand excavation and thermal mass retention. The price reflected what everyone else saw, which was a liability. Clara paid it for what she saw, which was a 78-degree differential waiting to be put to use. She began digging the second week of October before the first frost, while the ground was still workable. She pulled up the barn floorboards in the northeast corner and stacked them neatly because she would need them again later. The top 2 feet came up easily, loose topsoil and aggregate that the short-handled spade moved without much resistance. Below that, the soil changed. Denser, more cohesive, with a clay content that dragged on the blade, and required the pick she had brought specifically for this depth, a short-handled tool with a head weighted toward the point that broke the compacted clay in pieces she could then shovel out in sections. She worked mornings before the light came up, and evenings after it was gone, with a lantern hung from the lowest barn beam, casting orange light across the growing excavation. The horses and the mule moved to the far end of the barn and watched her with the patient neutrality of animals that have decided something is being handled by someone who knows what they are doing. She talked to them while she worked, not for their benefit, she knew, but for the quality of the silence she was interrupting. She told them about the soil temperature differential. She explained the principle of thermal mass, how dense material absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, stabilizing temperature the way deep water stabilizes weather above it. She described the survey document section by section, the data tables and the margin notes the assessor had made in a different ink that suggested he had returned to the document later and added observations he had forgotten to include the first time. The horses listened. The mule occasionally turned away at moments that seemed time to express disagreement, but it was possible she was reading into it. The hole reached 4 feet in depth by the end of the 3rd week of October, and the change was immediate and measurable. She had brought the mercury thermometer from Kansas specifically for this moment, a glass instrument in a leather case that she had wrapped in wool cloth inside the case to protect it from the journey. She held it at floor level inside the excavation and checked it after 10 minutes. 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the barn, the night air was 21. The differential at 4 feet was 23 degrees, and the excavation was not yet finished. She went down to 5 feet over the following week, working in a space now too narrow to turn around in, pushing the spade upward into the ceiling material and pulling the loosened soil back toward her body. The earth that fell on her face tasted of clay and old root fiber. She shook it out of her hair every hour by leaning over the edge of the hole and running her hands through until the soil fell. By the time she reached 5 feet, the thermometer read 41 degrees at floor level, with no fire burning anywhere near it, and the outside temperature at 16 above. The walls she reinforced with flat stones she had extracted during excavation, dry-laid in courses without mortar, fitted as close as the irregular surfaces allowed. She packed the gaps with a clay and dry grass composite she mixed in a bucket by the barn door, the mixture from a sod house construction guide she had read in the same Kansas boarding house where she had found the survey, a manual that recommended the clay grass composite for its insulating and gap-filling properties in below-grade structures. She applied it with her hands, pressing it into every gap until the wall surface was continuous. It dried overnight to something close to adobe. She tested the surface the following morning by pressing her palm flat against it and holding it there for 30 seconds. The cold that transferred through the stone and clay into her palm was mild, the gentle chill of something that was cold but not hostile, temperature at equilibrium rather than temperature in motion. She cut the ventilation shaft in the northwest corner, a diagonal bore that exited through the base of the north barn wall. Covered on the outside with a hinged wooden flap, she could close from below when the wind came from the north, and the pressure differential would have reversed the shaft's direction and drawn cold air in rather than pushing stale air out. The boring took 2 days because the diagonal angle required her to work above her head in the confined space, pushing the auger bit upward and pulling the loosened earth back down with a scraping motion that covered her completely in fine soil by the end of each session. She emerged from the barn each evening, looking like something that had been underground for considerably longer than a few hours, and walked to the cabin without looking at the road or the faces of anyone who might be watching from across it. What none of the men of Harlan understood yet was that the hardest obstacle she had faced so far was not the digging. It was 3 weeks away. November arrived and the temperature dropped in the way it drops in Harlan when the winter intends to be serious, not gradually, not apologetically, but with the directness of something that has made up its mind. The creek froze 2 weeks earlier than the previous year. The first morning below zero came in the first week rather than the third. The old men at the dry goods store read these signs with the expression of people who have seen this particular pattern before and know what follows it. They said it had the feel of the bad ones. Clara heard this and went home and worked faster. She laid the floor of the underground room with the pine boards she had set aside from the original barn floor, bedded over a layer of dry straw she had spread to a depth of 3 inches across the packed earth. The straw acted as the first thermal break between the floor surface and the ground below. Not because the ground below needed to be blocked out, which it didn't. The ground below was precisely what she was relying on, but because the straw created a pocket of still air at floor level that the human body would feel as warmth when standing or lying on the boards. She had read the principle in a third document, a letter from a Norwegian immigrant farmer to a relative back home describing the construction of his winter quarters, which she had found folded into the back cover of the survey document as though someone had placed it there deliberately as a companion piece. She built the stove from 3 large stones in a triangle formation with a cast-iron plate she had purchased from Ord, an interaction that had required 3 separate visits to his shop because the first 2 times he had kept the conversation going long enough to ask, in various formulations, what she was building. She had answered each time with approximately the same amount of information, which was the amount that answered the question technically, without providing context. She was building a heating element for an enclosed space. This was accurate. Ord had looked at her each time with the expression of a man who suspected the accurate answer was not the complete one, but he sold her the plate, and she took it back to the barn. The flue pipe ran from the stove up through a sealed hole in the barn floor directly above, then horizontally along the underside of the barn floor joists to the south barn wall where it exited through a sealed collar she had fitted with a cap that angled down to prevent snow from entering. She tested the seal with a lighted candle held near every joint. The flame told her where the seal was incomplete by bending toward the draft. She resealed every place the flame moved until it burned straight and vertical at every point along the pipe's length. It took 4 tests and 4 rounds of resealing before every joint was tight. She moved her bed down through the trapdoor on the 14th of November. The temperature in the underground room that evening, before lighting the stove, was 43 degrees. After 2 hours of fire, it reached 61. Outside the barn, the thermometer read 8 above 0. She recorded the numbers in the notebook and noted the wood consumption for the 2-hour period. Then she calculated how long her current wood supply would last at that consumption rate. Through a January, she was increasingly certain would not be ordinary. The answer required her to increase the supply by 30% before December. She started cutting the following morning. December brought the discovery that changed everything about what she had built. She had been monitoring the wall temperature inside the underground room since October, pressing her palm against the stone surface at the same point each morning before lighting the stove, holding it for 30 seconds, noting the sensation in the notebook with a descriptive word rather than a number, because she had no instrument precise enough to measure the difference she was feeling. In October, the word had been cold. In November, it had been cool. In the second week of December, the word she wrote was mild. The thermal mass of the earth surrounding the room had stabilized. 3 months of the stove's heat output, absorbed by the stone walls and the clay composite and the soil behind it, had raised the temperature of several tons of earth by enough degrees that the wall was now releasing energy rather than absorbing it. The room's overnight low, the temperature she recorded every morning before the first fire, had climbed from 41 degrees in October to 53 degrees in December, without any change in her firing schedule. The earth was returning what she had given it, slowly and steadily, the way earth returns everything it has held long enough. She recalculated the wood consumption for January based on the new overnight low. The required supply dropped by 20% from her December estimate. She had cut 30% more than her October baseline. She had more wood than she needed for the worst winter the old men at the dry goods store had ever seen, and she had it before January arrived. She did not tell anyone. She recorded it in the notebook under the date with the overnight low and a note that said, "Thermal mass fully stabilized." Ahead of calculation by 11 days. January 3rd, the temperature dropped to 15 below and kept falling. By the 7th, it was 28 below. By the 12th, the county office thermometer read 40 below 0 for the first time since 1886. Pipes burst. Animals died in uninsulated structures across the county. The wood supplies that families had considered adequate were gone in days rather than weeks. The men who gathered at the dry goods store in the mornings stopped talking about what they expected to happen and started talking about what had already happened, which was worse than any of them had expected when October began. The blacksmith Ord lost 4 animals on the night of the 11th. He had built his barn the way barns had been built in Harlan for 30 years, and 40 below 0 had passed through the walls as though they were paper. He stood in his barn in the morning with the lantern and counted what was left, and then stood for a while longer in the cold, doing nothing in particular, which is what a person does when the counting is finished and the number is worse than they prepared themselves to find. He came to Clara's barn at dawn on the 13th, with his feet wrapped in burlap tied with twine and his hat in both hands. He knocked on the barn door. Clara opened it. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything, looking at the warmth that came up from below and moved through the barn air with the particular quality of warmth that comes from a source that hasn't stopped, not the sharp warmth of a fire just lit, but the settled warmth of something that has been burning steadily long enough to heat the walls around it. He looked at the trapdoor in the barn floor, open, with the light and warmth rising from below. He looked at his feet in their burlap wrapping. He looked at Clara. He asked if he could bring his remaining animals inside. She told him yes. She told him where to put them and which side of the barn to use so the trapdoor end stayed accessible. She told him to have them inside before noon because the temperature was going to fall further in the afternoon, and she was keeping the barn door closed after that. He asked how she knew the temperature was going to fall. She showed him the barometric reading from the instrument she checked every evening. He looked at the number and looked at her and said nothing further about how she knew. He came back before noon. He brought 2 other men with him who had heard what she had said about the temperature falling further. They brought their remaining animals. They stood in the barn for a time in the warmth without speaking. The miller Vance arrived in the afternoon with his family and what remained of his livestock. The feed store owner, Croft, arrived that evening. By the end of the 13th of January, there were 11 people and 23 animals in and around the structure. Clara Marsh had built in the place that the men of Harlan had laughed at in October for being too cold, too exposed, and too far from any feature that would recommend it to someone planning to survive a serious winter in that part of the territory. She managed the space without drama and without reference to October. She assigned sleeping positions. She rationed the firewood. She took the barometric reading at 9 in the evening and told them what to expect in the morning. Nobody asked her how she knew to do any of it. The temperature outside was 40 below zero. That was the only credential that mattered now. The cold broke on the 19th of January. The temperature rose from 40 below to 12 below in a single afternoon and then continued rising over the following 3 days until it reached 12 above, which felt after what had come before like something close to warmth. The old men at the dry goods store said the pattern had run true to form. The worst came fast and left fast. What it left behind was a county-wide count of losses. The count was not good. 37% of livestock across Harlan County had died in the cold. 3 families had lost complete herds. 1 cabin had sustained structural failure from the contraction of the timber in the extreme cold. A wall separated from the foundation by 2 inches, enough to make the structure uninhabitable until spring. The county office registered it as the worst weather event in 28 years of recorded temperature keeping. In the barn on the north edge of town, every animal that had been brought inside on the 13th of January was alive on the 19th. Every person who had spent the nights of the cold in the underground room Clara Marsh had dug in October was alive and unhurt. The final overnight low recorded in the notebook during the cold event was 51 degrees Fahrenheit inside the underground room with the stove unlit on the night the outside temperature reached 40 below. The differential was 91 degrees. She had calculated 78 in October. The thermal mass stabilization had given her 13 degrees she hadn't counted on. She recorded the final numbers in the notebook. Then she closed it. The blacksmith Ord came by in February and stood at the barn door for a time before saying that he was thinking about doing something similar on the north end of his smithy. He asked if she still had the survey document from Kansas. She did. She lent it to him. He returned it 2 weeks later with a note that said he had started digging. She opened the notebook to a new page, wrote the date, and under it wrote a single word: others. The earth doesn't argue with anyone about what it knows how to hold. It just holds it for the ones who bother to ask.